Hello, I'm Brad.
And I'm Jason.
You are listening to
Dice in Mind.
I think back to what life was like December of 2019 and how different
The before times.
the world is. And we obviously, the pandemic had a humongous role in, you can't quantify, and you couldn't even try to go through all the changes that have occurred. I look at it from a business perspective, just because that's where I kind of live.
Yep.
But we both have done a good job of introducing change that they see from their perspective that the other person might have missed. So I'm richer myself for that from listening to you.
Oh, and vice versa. Yeah.
That being said,
Yep.
we're going to be talking tonight about race, ethnicity, culture in D&D.
Yep.
And I think this translates to other games. And I'll have a thought on it after the interview that came up. But the problem I had is the more we talked about this, the more questions and just the curiosity. And I'll let you introduce our guests, but we had said we'll keep this to a certain amount of time. And I finally had to say, okay, I can ask it questions in Twitter and I can send some messages and things. But there's going to be, I think, for folks, I truly hope our listeners are the type that will listen to this and see the benefits of this at a bare minimum. And I hate this to be this way, but at a bare minimum, and I've said this elsewhere, how enriching it creates and makes the game.
Well, and I think, Brad, if we have learned anything about the RPG community worldwide through this podcast, through our interactions on Twitter, through reading, whatnot, it is that this is a wonderful and welcoming community. And I think we are going to be preaching to the choir here. And so with that,
I really hope so. And I expect so, but I just, if there are folks that are going to be, this is going to be kind of a new topic for them.
Might be new. Yep. Think about it. Get the book. So we're specifically talking, in a moment, we are going to share our interview with Dr. Gwendolyn Marshall, who is not merely, air quotes, an actual philosopher, but is now an author and game designer. How cool is that? But what brought her to our attention is her book, and she's got others, but her book, Ancestry and Culture, an Alternative to Race in 5e. And so we don't want to say a whole lot about this, I think, right now, Brad. We'll get into the interview. But essentially, this is a response to the concerns about racial essentialism that have been raised in the past few years in the fantasy RPG realm. As you'll hear, it applies equally to sci-fi and superheroes and whatnot. But who knew? It turns out, thanks to Gwen's work and others, that by moving past racial essentialism, by recognizing that there are both issues of ancestry, biologically, and culture, societally, that not only are we better representing the real world in our fantasy games, but as you'll hear, you can hardcore geek out on character development. We should probably stop there.
Stop there because
we got excited in the interview, and they don't have to hear it twice.
Yeah.
So without further ado, we are really pleased to bring you just a really enlightening conversation. So here we go. Gwendolyn Marshall is a full-time game designer for 2C Gaming, as well as a frequent freelancer for Pinnacle Entertainment, MCDM, Archvillain Games, and more. She is also designer and co-owner of Arcanist Press, with whom she won 2 ENnie Awards. Her titles include Ancestry and Culture, an Alternative to Race in 5e, and S5e, Superheroic Roleplaying for 5th edition. She is also a college philosophy professor, a parent, and a pansexual transgender woman. All right, well, Gwen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Later for you than it is for us, because you're on the, well, I was going to say you're on the East Coast. You're in the Eastern time zone. Yeah, not so much the coast. Or are you not?
No, I'm in Central now.
Oh, because you're, okay.
I moved to St. Louis.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. So what brought you to St. Louis? I mean, it's a neat city, but.
I grew up here. So I moved back to be near family during the pandemic.
Yeah. You are definitely not the first I've heard that from. Just across. It's amazing how many grown adults, who may or may not be in middle age, just saying, have moved to relocate. You'll point that finger at yourself, Fred.
I'm pointing at you.
Yeah. It's amazing how many people have moved to be closer to loved ones because, I mean, why not? It just makes sense. The world has changed. Speaking of the world changing, so you and I think I can say your press, right? Arcanist Press, you have, well, you got a whole bunch of neat stuff out. But what really got our attention is your book, Ancestry and Culture, an Alternative to Race in 5e. And I don't think, Brad, you and I haven't talked a ton about this topic over the past few years several years of just getting back into RPGs, but especially because in my teaching we deal with race a lot, and it's one of the foci in our department. I have found myself increasingly questioning some of these concepts in the fantasy role-playing genre, sci-fi too, but especially fantasy.
You and I have talked about this too, because we've kind of talked about what companies seem to be more on the forefront of doing this versus some that tend to be, I don't want to say so much resistant, but just haven't fully grasped it.
Yeah. And so you're welcome to be as forthright or as gentle as you like about this, but maybe we could just start by picking your brain, because as far as I'm concerned, you've literally written the book. Hopefully this is the first of many that are going to come out, worldwide as people catch on. But for now, you've written the book, and literally one of the only books that addresses this at all. What was the impetus? What was the genesis, Gwen? Why actively respond to this concept of race specifically in this case D&D, but in RPGs in general? And then maybe we can transition to how did you create what you created as an alternative?
Sure. So I can't take credit for identifying this problem. I learned about it. It's mostly from authors, creators, players, gamers of color and marginalized communities. So for example, in 2011, I think I read an essay by N.K. Jemisin, the sci-fi author, called The Unbearable Baggage of Orking. And in it, she talks about encountering orcs. I think she might have been thinking about like World of Warcraft or something, but because she's a video gamer. But there are these sort of like just subhuman. They're dumber than humans. They're more violent than humans. And really the best response to them is to take a firm hand and either kill them or keep them in line through violence. And she said it really made her uncomfortable because it reminded her so much of the way in which, like African Americans had been treated in America and elsewhere in the past few hundred years. So it really ruined a lot of fantasy for her. And then, I had also encountered criticisms of Tolkien's kind of like the men of the West, versus the evil, darker men of the South and East, it's pretty obvious to see these as having racial overtones. And so it's not like I was the first person to see this. But in 2019, I was running a game. I'd been running a DMing a campaign for, I don't know, 2014 or something. And we went to level 20, 1 to 20.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we did the full thing. And, but I was aware of this problem, and I would create stuff for my players just for fun, little mechanics and mini games and stuff. And, I was reading people trying to address this. So there was a couple articles I read on D&D Beyond and of people trying to come up with alternatives to the kind of way in which Dungeons and Dragons associates things that we normally would think of as like behaviors or moral codes with race, with who your parents are. And everybody's like, okay, being born evil is really problematic, blah, 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 and there's a whole history I can talk about if you want to hear about it, about like Gary Gygax and racism and all sorts of nasty stuff.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So let me just give you one little taste of what I mean when I'm saying like it's endemic in this subculture. Though clearly I'm not saying everyone is racist who plays or anything or who creates it. But for example, there was a message board in the early 2000s, so about 20 years ago, where online, and Gary Gygax was on it before he died. And somebody asked him, hey, Gary, if I have a lawful good paladin, so this is supposed to be like the moral exemplar of the universe. This is the person that most instantiates moral goodness and perfection.
Right.
Can they, what would they do with orcs or goblins or evil races that surrender? Would they kill people that are voluntarily putting down their weapons and asking for mercy? And he said, and then some people chimed in and said, no, of course not. They're lawful good. They're the ones that would arrest them, right? And he said, no, that's stupid. They're not. That's lawful stupid. They would. This is Gary Gygax, the creator of Dungeons and Dragons. He's like, no, they'd kill them. They would kill the unarmed prisoners who were trying to surrender. And he then, and then somebody said, well, what about children? Like, what about like you defeat the orcs, but in their village are orc children. Do you kill them?
Yeah.
And then he actually quoted a guy named John Chivington, which was a colonel in the U.S. Army, I think, in the 19th century, a real person who was responsible for conducting a really horrific genocidal massacre of Native American women and children.
Wow.
And that quote is, and he even says, as Chivington once said, nits make lice.
Wow.
So Chivington said that about Native Americans. Kill the babies because they'll grow up to be adult Native Americans, which you want to kill is the idea. So subhumanizing, it's awful. It's really an awful thing to say about people. He said it, okay, now he's talking about orcs and stuff like this, but the very fact that he's using the very language of genocide in the real world to talk about these fantasy races and how we should treat them just really reinforces Jamison's original point that like, there's a lot of unpleasant overlaps here. I don't like that. So my thinking was, okay, look, it just so happened that at the time I was running that game, I didn't have any players of color. They're all white. But I thought, well, I wonder what it would look like to try to fix this, like to fix D&D so that you can still have D&D, but it doesn't have this gross racist, it's called, racial essentialism, right, in it. And there are a lot of people that have tried, and I didn't like, I recognize the value of what they're doing, but what they almost always did was make it more complicated, right? They're like, okay, you've got instead of choosing a race, you've got like a number of points and you can buy traits and it's really, and there's all these menus of options. And it was like, oh my God, I'm not playing D&D. I'm playing like GURPS or some other game that's much more complicated that isn't D&D. And then, of course, Wizards of the Coast later, after my book, their solution was whatever you want, just choose a race and then change the traits. See, it's not essential. But then what you lose is any narrative coherence. And the reason it's nice to be able to say I'm an elf or a dwarf is because everybody is like, oh, okay, I know roughly what that means. But if the rules are I'm an elf, but who knows what that means? In my case, it could mean anything. It's you kind of, why bother having elves? Right? It's like you lose the narrative value. There's no information gained anymore when you can say you're an elf. So I wanted to try to find something that still felt like D&D. We could still kind of lean on those fantasy tropes a little bit without it being gross. And so then I came up with something for my table, and one of my players was like, this is great. You should put it online. But then there was this thing called Zine Quest, the Kickstarter hosts periodically, which is like a DIY book, right? So I'm like, all right, I'll send a goal for $300 to buy one piece of art for the cover. And it got that in like 20 minutes. And then it hit like $7 or $8 grand, which is kind of a lot for like a black, like a PDF zine, basically. So I was like, oh, this is a thing. So then I decided to found Arcanist Press and put it out as a book.
Oh, interesting.
That's what actually created it.
Wow.
And that then it ended up, here's the thing though, I was still just responding to this 2019 kind of conversation. I put it out right at the end of May in 2020, Yes, 2020. I don't remember. I'm getting my years confused. I think 2020.
Everyone, Gwen, is getting their years confused. It's
we're
okay.
in 2020 part 3 at this point. So.
Right? I think so. So anyway, whenever it was, sometime you'll know when it is because about what I'm about to say.
Okay.
It came out the week before George Floyd happened.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Mhm.
And so then the Black Lives Matter movement exploded again after it was founded at Ferguson, but it kind of had this huge resurgence in that period. And in the tabletop gaming world, there was then again this big debate about race again. And my book just happened to be coming out right at the right time.
Wow.
So I think I got a combination of lucky timing. I wasn't planning on that. It just obviously I didn't know, but with maybe it's a decent solution too.
Yeah, I'd say so. So identify a problem in practice, write a short book on it, found a press to distribute that book. I mean, that's that's just why not? Because of all the free time you undoubtedly had. Right.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
So can you tell us about, for those who don't know about Arcanist Press, what can you tell us?
Oh, sure. So I originally created it in order to put this book out.
Yeah.
And so I put it out in May of 2020 after the Kickstarter. And then I've put out 5 or 6 more books that are in that kind of in that vein, in that series, that expand all the options and so on and so forth. And then I've co-partnered with a friend of mine's company, Sigil Entertainment, and a bigger company called Pinnacle Entertainment, which makes the game Savage Worlds and Deadlands. And I wrote a superhero game now. That's the newest thing, called S5E, which takes the 5th edition rules of Dungeons and Dragons and changes it to make it a modern superhero game. If you're into that thing. And that we kickstarted that last summer, and that did pretty well. And now it's going to be, Pinnacle is putting it in like a like a fancy hardcover with the little ribbon bookmark and all that crap.
Congrats. That's super cool. Yeah. That's wow.
So Arcanists kind of got subsumed into Pinnacle a little bit when they took up that project. And Arcanist Press still exists, but I'm now working as a full-time game designer for 2C Gaming, which is like a middle-sized gaming company as well, putting out other stuff. So that's the short version of the story.
We really never know where the paths are going to lead, do we? God, that is not a joke. Okay, so coming back then to Ancestry and Culture, the book, but also the concepts. So, so there's so many places we can go with this. Probably most of them are better for definitely it should be sitting down over a cup of coffee or something and spending a few hours to get into the weeds. But the balance between ancestry and culture, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? We know that it recognizes both the biology and the society of being human. I think it's in how you explain it in the book, very straightforward, very well grounded. But I'm curious. So where I got tripped up is so mechanically, and it's just because we haven't had a chance to play it. Mechanically, what does that look like? If someone wants to, well, first of all, everyone should go and buy this, but then and get the printed, because it's just a beautiful little volume. And I gotta say, the artwork really helps to tell the story.
Yeah,
it really nails it. I was so impressed with that. Especially the cover. But how would this look if someone wants to, in a nutshell, if someone wants to move beyond race and use ancestry and culture and have it mechanically work? What are some tips you can give them?
Sure. So the short version of what the book does is, now remember I alluded to these more complicated ways of solving the problem.
Right.
Now, traditionally what you do when you make a character in D&D, as you know, is you choose race and then you choose class. So you might say elf, fighter. Yeah. So everybody who is familiar with D&D knows that first step very well. It's like, am I an elf or a dwarf or a gnome or a human or whatever? So what I do is basically I just ask you to make that choice twice. So the first one is who your parents are or your ancestry. And that gives you half of the features that are normally associated with your race. And then you'd make the choice again. And that gives you the other half. So if you choose elf twice, you are mechanically identical to, in the original system, you choose just elf.
Choose that simple. Okay.
Right. So if you choose elf for your first choice and dwarf for your second, then you have half of your racial traits are elven and half of them are dwarven.
Right.
And it's just, and the way it's broken down is if you have elf as your ancestry, you get things like elf. Your age is elven. You're going to live 1,000 years. You get dark vision. You get that thing where you don't sleep. You just go into trance, because those are almost certainly like biologically inherited.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas you get dwarven weapon training and heavy armor proficiency and all the stuff, or smithing tools or whatever, all the stuff that would be part of the dwarven culture. Yeah. And that's what you get instead of like elven longbow or whatever, right? And then of course you get the dwarvish language instead of the elvish as your language, in addition to common. So mechanically, the output is absolutely equivalent to the original system. It just is, it allows you to mix and match some of the choices.
Yeah, I was really overthinking it. That's really elegant, and that's really, when you explain it, that's really straightforward. And I got to say, what I like is, I find that very resonant with my thinking, because like the way you just described it and the way you described it in the book, it's obviously more realistic. Like if we were going to say, look, this is a fantasy world, but we want it, and blah, blah, blah magic, but we want it to also be rooted in some sense of reality, right? I mean, Brad and I are always talking about games and reality and whatnot. And this to me allows one to do that and kind of make potentially far more interesting characters than anything that's just pigeonholed, like, especially like, well, I'll just stop there. I think it allows for a far more nuanced, far more realistic and playable character.
Well, I think it just how you simplified it, I can only see it as it creating a richer experience for gamers, just my opinion. What's been obviously I suspect you've kind of implemented this and integrated it even before maybe you publish with the team or the game group that you DM. What's been the kind of the feedback you've gotten from other groups out there?
Yeah.
So it's been, I mean, setting aside for a moment people that have knee-jerk reactionary responses that anything you're challenging us, that you must, blah blah blah. Setting that aside, I've been the kind of wonderful surprise for me was how much it does do for narrative, for the story. Because if you're creating a character and you're like, okay, it's step one, race, okay, elf, I guess, right? Or human, like, how boring. Everybody like, okay, I guess I'm an elf. We're all the same. We're just generic elves. But if you say I'm an elf raised by orcs, all of a sudden you're like, what's the story there, right? And I'm an elf raised by orcs who became a druid. It's like, you want to know, like, that just tells so much more story. And it's like it's like, it doesn't add a lot of complexity to it, but the narrative payoff is huge. I will add one other thing. After I created the book, I went back, I realized the potential for something. So it's at the back, it's at the end of the rules. It's an optional choice. So normally what happens when you choose your ancestry, this does add one wrinkle of complexity, but I don't think it's too much. You just choose elf, dwarf, gnome. But what I give you is the option to choose mixed ancestry.
Yeah.
And so what you do is then you choose one trait from two. So you're like, well, I want this thing from the, like, stone cunning from the dwarf or whatever, and I want fate trance or whatever from the elf. And then you can tell the story of, I have my character is elven and dwarven heritage. Like they have an elf parent and a dwarf parent.
Right.
And that's what the art does for me. The art is almost all characters that are of mixed ancestry. And I love that, because that does create, again, even more. You're like, wait a minute, a halfling and an orc had a baby. Like, oh, how did that happen? I want to know this love story, right? And that's really a lot of fun. It lets characters kind of have such rich stories and backgrounds. So that's been probably my favorite kind of surprise payoff, is the narrative benefit of doing that. And it's, like I said, it's just so much more fun. I mean, after all, if you lived in a fantasy world where all of these fantasy races are all living together,
exactly,
why wouldn't
know
they?
Better.
Right. I mean, and the thing that currently D&D has, which everyone's like, this is a little weird and creepy, only humans are having sex with other people. Because you can be a half elf.
Still sounds on brand, but we're with you.
Right. But it's like, well, why wouldn't you can have a half elf and you can have a half orc, but you can't have a parent, like an elf orc. You know what I
Right.
mean? Also, the whole half language, generally people of mixed ancestry aren't real keen on that because,
No, yeah.
right,
Oh,
it's really
yeah.
problematic. So like, instead of talking about halves and, like how much blood quanta you have or something,
Yep.
we just say, well, pick two of the
Mhm.
ancestries and you were of these ancestries.
Yeah.
That's however you
Smart.
want to calculate that. So that ends up being, I mean, after all, here's another thing that's fun is, yes, it's true that elf is a trope that we can all lean on to make it. It's like a narrative shortcut. And so I do add a little more complexity to that, but it ends up that actually classic fantasy has a lot of characters just like that. Like, one way of thinking about Aragorn is kind of, he's like a human, sort of human with elven kind of cultural characteristics.
Right.
So it's almost like he's a human raised by elves. You've got like Carrot Iron Founderson from like Terry Pratchett is a human raised by dwarves. Like those kind of like fish out of water, like odd person out. Those are the ones that go on the fantasy adventures.
Yes.
So it feels like it actually does for me, a better job of capturing like classic fantasy tropes that way too.
That's really cool.
I'll go out on a limb here and hopefully it's not offensive. I don't see that as complex, what you said with that.
Fair.
I just see that as maybe it takes a little extra time during your session 0 character build period.
Right.
But by doing that, I can just think, Jason and I haven't played a ton since we started doing this, started getting back into it. But I can just think, Jason, just you and I together when we game this, we could spend a lot of time just developing our
I got to go
characters.
back and redesign the wizard we haven't played yet because I didn't have this yet. But again, in terms of that little bit of complexity added, Gwen, I mean, right, multi-classing, it's more complicated. So you have to, there are a couple more steps. It's well worth the payoff.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I have I'm going to put you on the spot with a philosophical question.
Well, didn't you say you weren't going to put her on the spot before we started recording? Way to go.
Ready.
Well,
Bring it.
well, I think this is okay because you are a philosopher by trade, right?
Yep.
And you're talking about essentialism, racial essentialism, and whatnot. And so, as I was prepping for this discussion, and as I was reading your book, and then I was triggered again by something that I read in one of the D&D books on my shelf. I know what it was. It was when I was making that wizard that we haven't played yet. So one of the things that's and I get it historically, and I get it, I guess, narratively, kind of like the same reason why in Star Trek and even Star Wars, most people look oddly human. I get the practicality. You might know where I'm going with this, but there is clearly in D&D and just the fantasy RPG realm, there's clearly just basic human essentialism, right? Like even if we stick with D&D races, you go through the races, and if you're human, well, you don't stand out. You're just good at everything a little bit. Right. I wonder, undoubtedly you thought about that. I wonder what your response to that is and how you have worked with that.
That's a good question. So I'd say it depends exactly what your kind of complaint is or question.
Not a complaint, just a quandary. Yeah.
Well, the way you're thinking about this problem. So on the one hand, you might say, why are all of the playable races so humanoid? Is that what you're suggesting? Like they all are
sorry. No, I was drifting. It was back. I'm curious specifically because I get that.
Why humans are boring?
Why humans are buffed from the beginning, right? There's this basic essentialism of we're kind of milquetoast, but we're kind of good at everything, as opposed to the other races each have their one or two things. And I'm just curious because you've kind of ridden the antithesis to that.
Yeah, so I think this isn't just fantasy, actually. I find it to be like a super common trope in sci-fi too.
Absolutely.
Is, like humans venture out into the intercultural galaxy and they join the, like I'm thinking like Mass Effect or something. They join the council and people are like, those upstart humans. And the difference between humans and other species is that they're like more ambitious or they're more exploratory or like, what, why, right? Why? I never bought that. Like this gets kind of like this human exceptionalist thing. And it's like, I think that if there were intelligent races that we encountered, they probably would be just as exploratory and adventurous as we are, or maybe far more, right? Why would we be that special? I'm kind of anthropocentric in that way. So what's the solution in fantasy? That's tough because I felt I was pulled in two directions. One, I wanted to solve this problem, but two, I wanted to make the solution still identifiably Dungeons and Dragons and compatible with default vanilla
Yeah,
Dungeons and
of
Dragons.
course.
So I couldn't radically re-envision or reconceptualize what being human meant. I did make changes. I did make it so that they are they're not more powerful. They're just more they're slightly honestly, they're more boring, but they're a little more flexible.
Okay.
Right. So in other words, you just get to like choose what skill proficiency you want or something instead of it being like one of these four or whatever, and things like that. So you know, I talk a little bit about like maybe that you have the option of one of the other alternatives is to have a multicultural culture option. That's one of the like optionals rules at the end too. And so it's like, imagine humans just end up picking up like little bits of like half a dozen fantasy languages or traits from 3 or 4 other fantasy cultures. So I imagine them as being more like, maybe they're more like they're good mimics or something because they're a younger race or whatever historically in the fantasy pantheons. So they're kind of like learning from these other cultures more. That was the spin I put on it because I wanted it to still feel like D&D. And that seems to loosely slot in with D&D kind of cult like lore. They're the new kids on the block, right? All these other fantasy races are much older and more established.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Spin.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If I could take a right turn for a second. So how is this, I don't want to say affected but you know, how is this played into the work you're doing with other games, with the development you're doing with other games?
So we use an ancestry and culture mechanic in the superhero game. So for example, and again, when I say it this way, you'll be like, oh, well, of course. When you choose your race or your ancestry in the superhero game, you might choose human, like earthling or mutant, like human or mutant or alien, or someone from the like far past or future, like time traveling human. But we all know that one of the most common tropes in comic books is an alien sent down to Earth as a baby, you know, Superman, and raised on Earth, or a human who ends up discovering that they're an inhuman or a mutant, right? So they're a mutant ancestrally, but they're a human culturally, or an earthling culturally, right? Or you're to go in the opposite direction, you are Star-Lord and you're ancestrally a human, but you're raised in space. Right. So you're like, oh, well, it works perfectly in comic books, too, because we like stories like that, apparently.
Yeah, I keep thinking of the Kirk phenomenon, which is a bit of a side, but similar kind of challenge.
Yeah.
I have a bit of a closing question, but I want to turn it back to you, Brad, to make sure that.
No, I think that, and just so people know, when you're talking about the superhero game, you'd kind of mentioned this before we recorded this S5E. Right. This is kind of a 5e derivative for those of our listeners that aren't aware of it. What's the game? What's the name of the game? Just
S5E Superheroic Roleplaying for 5th edition.
Oh, yes, slick. Okay, and that
because I'm notorious. Jason laughs. I'm notorious to do a little purchasing while we're in the middle of a recording.
Whereas little means it's amazing he wasn't already on the computer ordering. No, we're not joking.
Well, because I didn't know. That's why I had to ask.
I know.
Okay.
So wait. So this is out or it's coming out?
It has been released to backers of the Kickstarter, but we are doing that thing where we don't want to put it on sale just yet because you know, so the Kickstarter backers feel special.
Oh, absolutely.
So you can pre-order it through BackerKit right now, and then it'll be appearing on Pinnacle store page and it drives through awesome. RPG and stuff soon.
Yeah, that's incredible. So okay, so my last question then is, I mean, you're obviously so busy with these projects, and you put out, like you said earlier, you put out a bunch of follow-up material to Ancestry and Culture, right? It's a wonderful rabbit hole that Brad, as soon as we hang up, can start to order. And you laugh,
but there's truth to that.
But
there's truth to that.
Yeah. But given you're working on these other things right now, these other projects, is there any chance in the future you will come back to D&D to continue with this idea?
I have one more book of ancestries and cultures that I plan on putting out eventually. Just got sidetracked by the big kind of superhero thing. But that doesn't mean, of course, I'm finished with Dungeons and Dragons, right? If with this final book that we'll be putting out, it's been like something like 150 or 200 ancestries and cultures you can choose from, you know, like every anthropomorphic animal race,
Yeah.
and I tried to just draw from every kind of like global mythology and like all kinds of weird new things.
So cool.
And also bizarro ones, like you can play like a swarm person, or you can play like a headless horseman, which is called a Dullahan, which is like a mythological character. Anyway, so all kinds of weird stuff to play, which because it's fun. But now I'm moving on because I'm working for another company called 2C Gaming.
Yeah.
And I'm doing D&D stuff with them. We just are finishing up a book called Weird Wastelands, which was written in concert with the WebDM YouTube channel people. Yeah, they had a big Kickstarter like a year ago, and they hired us to help them produce the book. So I was writing content for them up until very recently.
Awesome.
So I'm still very immersed in D&D for sure.
Good.
I was going to ask a question. If I know that's kind of a good wrap-up question, but I need to backtrack for a second just because I'm personally curious now. Is
again on brand.
Yeah. If have you gotten any? Thank you. Have you gotten like any feedback or communication? Has Wizards reached out or anything? Or
no, they're notoriously, they don't generally take on ideas from the community directly. What'll happen is like there was a big furore about it, a big hubbub. My book was the thing that people were often pointing to and saying, hey, what about this? They issued a vague statement that said they have plans in the works.
Yeah.
And then 6 months later, they put out Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which had a one-page thing stuck on the front, which is like, okay, so you might be worried about race. Just do whatever you like. It's great. It's an optional rule. The end. And they just moved on. And a lot of people were like, that's it. So many people think nowadays that they are getting ready to present something newer in the whatever 5.5, which is coming in 2024. What that will look like, I don't know. Let me put it this way. No one's called me and offered me a fat check.
Well, that's strange.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, because don't you think that publications like Radiant Citadel, some of the stuff that's coming, I mean, it's kind of hinting at an interest to move in this direction.
I think so. And I think I think that they've been trying, and I don't want to sound like I'm overly critical. They're a big ship. It takes a long time to turn. And they also are kind of stuck near the end of a cycle of products, and they can't just like bin the original player's handbook at this point or something. They need to make it all backwards compatible. So they've probably had their hands tied basically a little bit. So they're trying to make gestures in that direction here and there. And they're doing a better job with whom they are hiring to write their products. Radiant Citadel is a great example of it's the most diverse book they've ever staff they've ever had on a book. I'm looking forward to it. I think they're gonna do something to address this more substantially when they're able in 2024. I hope.
I want to be able to we'll put this in the show notes and everything, but I want to be able to before we wrap up, just so folks know where to hit Arcanist Press and get your books. But one more question. We told you half an hour, but I keep coming up with these in my head. Did you or have you seen acceptance or resistance to any of this generationally, like Gen Z is a little more open to it versus Gen X or millennials or anything like that? I'm just curious because, younger players are playing this now versus even prior to pandemic. So I'm just wondering if you saw any sort of change in the tide or anything.
I mean, it's what you'd expect, right? So players that started playing in 5th edition, when Wizards was at least trying to make some efforts at diversity, like give them credit. The player's handbook had a Black woman as the human piece of art, for example, or the fighter, like there's all this, they're trying, especially in the art, to be diverse. And, there's a lot of gender and sexual orientation diversity in a lot of the adventures nowadays. So, and that's just the way everyone is talking too in the community. So, younger players, because they're not falling back on 30 years of what it used to be like, are more likely to be accepting of this. They're also more likely to be across the board. They're more likely to be whatever, queer or LGBTQ or whatever. And but I'm still, it still happens that I'll meet like I talked briefly to Ed Greenwood, the creator of the Forgotten Realms. Who's he created it before D&D existed. And he was like, oh, this is great. So he was on board with the idea of this. So I mean, it's not, I wouldn't want to oversimplify it as a generational battle, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of
not
just
completely cut and dry.
No, I mean, it's maybe like voting habits. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's a good way to that's a good way to put it. Gwen, thank you so much for joining us. This is it's even more exciting now. I mean, I just keep looking over at the book. I'm eager to use it in play. Of course, I mean, we're both eager to just play someday again, but I'm eager to try this, and especially with you titrating it, in retrospect now, it seems so clear how this can work, and I'm really eager to use it with those backstories and the narratives. This is really cool. Thank you so much.
Oh no, thank you for having me. It was a fun conversation.
So thank you to Dr. Gwen Marshall for joining us tonight. We could have talked with you, Gwen, for probably another half an hour. I think I kind of alluded to this
probably
at the beginning.
way more, but it really should have been over something like coffee and
I think you alluded to that, you even said that in the interview, if I remember correctly.
The next step was this was going to become a coffee house conversation where we'd be there for several hours and have to get kicked out at close.
Yeah. And to have someone that learned and a philosopher, who could talk about this stuff, nerd time. So what I propose is for our GM corner, let's move over there, is let's kind of wrap.
Yes.
I don't want to say we're going to wrap a bow about this, because this is something that's going to continue to be a topic for us, and I hope for the community for a long time.
Yeah, we will keep coming back to this over episodes.
What is, so, I alluded to this at the beginning, and one of the things, and we're going to talk about this during the episode that we're doing, where we're going to talk about some world building. Yep,
that's coming up
in the future.
Or actually, sorry, we've already talked about that, but you and I have more planned.
Yes,
now it's going to change a bit in the future, because
that's my point is that when we come back to that topic, I've talked about the length of time it took me to build Homeland, the world.
Yep. Your homebrew.
Yeah, my homebrew. And you know this, I got an immense amount of joy out of doing that. It was an absolute blast to do. I sit here and think to myself, boy, I could have just as much fun just building. I could see myself building 3, 4, or 5 characters and just keeping them in my hip pocket for when, inevitably, with all the gaming we're doing, sarcasm and eye roll intended. Right. So, and I mean that in a good way. You and I are very busy. We don't get to play, but this one, the way Gwen explained it tonight, not that the book wasn't clear for me, it just the simpler. Light bulb went on.
Agreed.
And I don't know, I'll let you discuss it, but for me, it's just all I want to do right now is get out her book in the player's handbook and
build a character. I know. I mean, it's, we're fortunate. We continue to get to talk with and meet really lots of really interesting people, really interesting creatives. And sometimes, that light bulb goes off. And I think that's a really good way to put it, Brad, because for both of us, I mean, I could see it with both of us. It was like, oh yeah, click. This is like we need to hang up so we can start working on characters. Like I said in the interview, I have that wizard that I built for just because I wanted, I was ready to play a wizard finally, but now I want to go back maybe in the next week or two and rewrite some of his story. And then I really like your idea of putting it in a shared document where we can essentially share narrative back and forth on some characters.
Yeah, and I think I'll leave that second part out, just about our next adventures and all that. But I think,
and how you're going to kill my PCs. But go on.
No. This time I won't, because I think it would almost be disrespectful to Gwen to do that. Just
everybody, you heard that, right? Okay.
Yeah. Unless you try to use what was it? Short axes, or what were you using? Where you had
that's right. Yeah.
Throwing axes.
Axes.
Yeah. As long as you don't choose that as a weapon of choice, then you will be fine. Actually, you won't. But I'm just going to give you a small false sense of comfort. Yeah, I am. normally we give each other, we're getting back into a mode now where we are recording the pre and the post. You're getting a little fourth wall break back.
We're doing
approach.
It all together
where we
it's so
haven't.
much better for us. Yep.
So you're getting, whereas we have had time to process.
Yeah, you're getting our fresh responses.
You're getting our visceral reactions, which are I think are still processed. It's just to me, there's an excitement coming out of that discussion.
Yes. Yes.
A real excitement about what this can do for our gaming, and what this could do for games that we are involved in where we might not even be leading the game.
And how it's one more venue wherein D&D and other role-playing games can be forces for good, forces for a better world, not quote unquote merely because they can be healthy to play, because they allow for positive socialization, etc. They relieve stress, but because they can help to normalize what we want the world to look like, which is pretty cool.
It is, and I'm going to end with in a somewhat rhetorical question, because I think the only person that could really answer it, neither of you and I could provide conjecture.
Yeah.
The question I have, and that I leave to everyone here, is the book. You heard Gwen talk about this. The book came out May 2020, right around the time of George
Floyd murder and all the unrest. Yeah.
So if that book had come out, or if Gwen had tried to put that book out 5 years ago, what would have been the reaction? And Gwen, I should have asked you that. I leave that as an open question. We'll have to have you back. But I asked that not in a negative way. I'll flip it, and I'm gonna be quiet. It obviously seems to have been the right time for this material to come out, because we are seeing a generation of gamers come in that will be so much more open to this idea than perhaps even well, I'm not gonna impugn anyone, but I just think there are.
So everyone, Brad, it's a great rhetorical question, and no one can answer it.
No.
Everyone, thanks for joining us. Think about the question, and think about, please, role-playing games, TTRPGs, making the world a more fun and truly better place. Be well, stay well. Really looking forward to talking to you in the coming weeks with the guests we have lined up.